You've just entered the Gen Experience. I'm Victor, and like many of you from the era, each new day was just one step closer to nuclear annihilation.
It burns.
With the success of such an incredibly made film as Oppenheimer, I want to tell you a story of another time where the nuclear war itself was not only front page news, but part of everyday life and common topic of conversation for every citizen, including us children. I'll try to make this light, but needless to say, the topic was heavy for a kid living the Gen Experience. We were all aware of the common dangers of the 80s: piranha, alien encounters, and takeovers by sentient artificial intelligence. And at any moment, we would have to face those realities. But terms like finger on the button, the bomb, and a nuclear winter were even a greater threat to us kids than stumbling into a pool of quicksand. We were living in the Cold War, and all those school drills for boomers faced with such a situation were as extinct as those who believed exercises like that would somehow help during a disaster of that magnitude. We were kids, but the constant barrage of headlines, nightly news broadcasts, and even the content of our popular movies and favorite music had us spending too much time thinking about absolute destruction and unfathomable devastation. These weren't surreal concepts, but an omnipresent menace just around the corner.
Well, big day's only a few hours away now. I'm sure you're all looking forward to it as much as we are.
This is how we learn to stop worrying and love the bomb. Well, maybe not love, but as ironic as it sounds, at least make peace with it.
It burns.
We lived during the Cold War, an ideological struggle for influence by national superpowers, following their roles as allies in World War II after the victory of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. We Gen Xers just inherited what in a nutshell boils down to geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, what we called the USSR at the time. There was no actual large-scale fighting between us, but each supported opposing sides in major conflicts that led to mounting pressure and fear, especially in the minds of young people like me, kids whose imaginations ran wild with thoughts of a world after the buttons were pressed.
If you were not ready and did not know what to do, it could hurt you in different ways.
These images and descriptions of the horrors of nuclear war were top of mind. To understand just how ingrained they were in our daily lives, some of the most popular shows, including comedies, took on the topic and made them all too real.
Sunshine Cadet Troop I've been helping out with. This was done by one of the girls. She calls it nuclear bomb the day after. 8 years old, and this is the kind of thing that's on her mind.
That's unbelievable.
Oh, it's so sad. When I was 8 years old, I was just worried about the usual childhood things. How much would the tooth fairy leave me? What would I get from Santa? Would I ever be chosen small curd cottage cheese queen?
Speaking of music, just seems like today's music doesn't have the same meaning or the same depth, but a barren wasteland of relationship status and subject matter like WAP. The music in the Gen Experience tried to tell us something, even warn us. Story songs that push the envelope with deep-seated meaning, where the artists put into words their honest fears, utter disdain, and ultimate surrender. Themes that are lost on today's artists, in their songs brimming with shallow cliches and void of weighty material, forcing us to look up and take notice. Poetic lyrics that were often indirect, but were not difficult to decipher, filled the Cold War 80s. Some bands concealed nothing and dished out the uncertainty of the nations, the people in power, and the very real outcome of life succumb to these threats. Check out some of these popular artists and their great songs of the era. Now, for something completely different, the era had a way to remind us that sometimes the only way to get through futility was with a good laugh. Weird Al's Christmas at Ground Zero was a poignant but lighthearted take on the current political climate. In an effort to be a little bit more to the point, the song is only a parody of style. In this case, that of Phil Spector, but not a parody of a song itself. This was an original, and all Weird Al. With their melancholy melodies and haunting lyrics, the very idea of obliteration was ever present. How many of these songs do you remember? Did you know at the time what they were alluding to or hoping to convey? Let's compare notes in the comments. When we weren't listening to our radio, we also had to live in the shadow of the final countdown. No, not Europe's final countdown about leaving Earth, but an actual clock ticking away until the end of days. Since 1947, the Doomsday Clock had been a visual symbol of man-made global catastrophe, a metaphor for human threat from political and military, scientific, or technological advances. Talking to you, Skynet. If they go unchecked. The catastrophe is marked by midnight on the clock, and how close we are is represented by the minutes and seconds until it is here. Each year, the clock time shown is evaluated for change, with one of the influencing factors being a nuclear risk. The clock's original setting in 1947 was 7 minutes to midnight. It has since been set backward 8 times and forward 17. The farthest time from midnight was 17 minutes in 1991, and the nearest is only 90 seconds. That time being set just this past New Year of 2023. The image was seen often in both television and print media as a constant reminder of our mortality and the results of our actions. As you can tell, it is mostly ignored today for more immediate satisfaction and gratification, or else it's just to alleviate unnecessary stress for the general public. While our worries were intensified at the movies, films of this uncertain time recorded the history of our culture as it unfolded. With such a commercial medium and mass audiences, movies telling stories of or related to the threat of the aftermath of nuclear war had been in a dry spell since the end of the 60s, where radioactive creatures ran amok at teenage beach parties. But after the 1970s hiatus, Hollywood hit back in the big 80s. Thought-provoking and even disturbing endings were commonplace, leaving little room for a happily ever after as the credits rolled. Ronald Reagan rejected previous Cold War foreign policy norms based on the USSR's undemocratic system and totalitarian tendencies, and famously referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire in 1983. Well, movies knew this theme was not only topical but marketable, and no one could market world political tension better than Bond, James Bond. Other films tackled tension with hope, others real consequence. Some movies only flirted with Cold War ideas and thrilling suspense, while even more made us uncomfortable.
It burns.
We needed that about now, didn't we? Luckily, it wasn't all doom and gloom. On a much larger scale than our music, this very real topic could at times be a catalyst for laughs. We aren't even covering cinema that dealt with the population's fear of not just nuclear war, but the production of nuclear energy, both for powering our communities and our weapons. And we can't forget those images on the small screen. TV movies that produced big impact. The Man Who Saw Tomorrow. It was a documentary, and I use that loosely. Although released in theaters, it was on HBO where most people caught this terrifying attempt at scaring us to death. Manipulating the 4-line poetic quatrains of 16th century prophet Nostradamus, the producers were able to create panic, conspiracy, and terror for the viewer. So it worked, convincing us the soothsayer had been spot on up until then. It stands to reason that his predictions of the 1980s and beyond must be inevitable. Only 5 years away, the assumed excited return of Halley's Comet was now a harbinger of death, as the movie tells of the great famine the comet will bring with it in 1986. The images show dried earth, and worse yet, hideous concepts of humans ultimately led to become flesh-eating cannibals. You could imagine this would send any 7 or 8-year-old running out of the room with their hands covering their eyes. Believe me, I know. 1988? Well, that was to bring World War III, starting with wiping New York off the map. As most content like this of the era, it was rated PG. But this wasn't fictional scares we could deal with, but presented as what tomorrow will bring. And any kid unlucky enough to stumble across this program during one of its many cable airings, the future was simply a countdown to extinction. The combination of stock footage, poor effects, bland reenactments, complete with sets from the $6 Million Man, and the narration dripping with dread and pregnant pauses perfectly suited for once great classic Hollywood heavyweight Orson Welles, long before he became a ravenous monster-eating planet, manifested the full horrors we had to look forward to. Welles carefully delivered the obvious successes of Nostradamus' prophecies so believably. Who was I to doubt the unimaginable death we were promised in the film? Luckily, when 1988 came and went, and most of those predictions didn't come to pass, I was a little older, and some of those fears began to subside. Still, I should have never been allowed to watch this. CNN was a fairly new cable network, debuting as the first 24-hour news network in 1980. It may seem odd today, but I bet few batted an eyelash when Ted Turner directed his company to create a specific broadcast in preparation for the end of the world, with direction for CNN to make this the last video broadcast, to play it in the last minutes. at the moment right before all communication was lost. Okay, I added that part for dramatic effect, but I figured that's what they were imagining. But the real downer was the day after. Not the morning after pill, the TV movie in 1983 that probably delivered the most realistic and dramatic telling of possible all-out global nuclear war on a scale many of us could not comprehend. To date, nothing has been so pointedly created to simply horrify us, with the hopes to deliver the same effect as scared straight tactics, hoping the world was listening. Do you remember the day after? Did you get to watch it? What are your memories of this television event? Tell me in the comments and we can discuss therapy there. Now, I didn't watch the movie. I was too aware of nuclear war by this time, and with the marketing leading to its premiere, this was a television event that few could escape.
Imagining beyond tomorrow and into the day after.
Lucky for me, my mother knew to deny my eyes from the disturbing scenes that approximately 100 million in our population witnessed that night. The impact was telling when they only talked the next day at school or the water cooler at the office, not to mention a couple weeks of nightly newscasts covered the aftermath of the film. Aftermath as though it had actually been the end of the world. The day after was a one-time television movie event, and so many sat down to watch. Most were blown away, figuratively, of course. The movie was made all too real as they stopped airing commercial breaks once the nuclear assault had begun on screen, effectively denying you a snap back into reality or breaking focus on the disturbing images on your screen. You couldn't look away, and the result was exactly what they hoped for. Not designed to fool viewers into thinking it was live like the also narrated by Orson Welles broadcast of War of the World. The effect on the mental well-being of many who watched was unparalleled, with opinions, fear, and outrage by the people. If the filmmakers were hoping for a response, they would get one. Reagan had already dismissed the idea of vulnerability provides security, championing the Strategic Defense Initiative with hopes to render nuclear weapons obsolete. The new program, cleverly dubbed Star Wars by the media for its possible use of satellite weaponry, triggered Soviet anxieties. The Soviets were genuinely alarmed by the prospect of American science turned on and venturing into the realm of space defense. This was happening in March 1983, but after a private screening of the day after in October of that year, President Ronald Reagan wrote this in his diary the following morning. Very effective, and left me greatly depressed. On November 20th, 1985, 2 years from the premiere of the sobering movie of nuclear desolation, Reagan and Gorbachev agreed that they would meet in November of 1985 in Geneva to discuss nuclear arms reduction. This was big news and all over the media. For the first time in 6 years, the leaders of the Soviet Union and the USA met in Geneva, Switzerland. And then, historically, in 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which resulted in the banning and reducing of their nuclear arsenal. In Reagan's memoirs, he drew a direct line from the film to the signing. Then you know what happened? World peace. Okay, maybe not, but the fall of the Berlin Wall and the toppling of communism, well, something like that. I got a show to keep moving here, and I don't pretend to be a political scientist or analyst, so look it up yourself. So perhaps loving the bomb is a little too enthusiastic, a little too sarcastically melodramatic. Oh, but speaking of love, have you given a like to this video? Go ahead and do that right now. Thank you. No, there was nothing to love, but learning to accept it was just as important if we wanted to keep our sanity. If I hadn't, I'm not sure how I would have made it through high school. Luckily, by 14, my fears had been eased, which was necessary when attending a school called the Bombers, where the official mascot is an atomic mushroom cloud. Yeah, imagine that. And no, I'm not kidding. It had been part of everyday life, infused in our media, and we learned the distinct possibility of a worst-case scenario. Kids like me, and maybe you, understood the threat, were often reminded of it, and we thought about it. Perhaps you thought of it a lot, and deeply. So much so that your 4th grade teacher asked you one day why you were so upset, only for you to respond, because I worry about nuclear war.
Dear Mr. Gorbachev, my name is Rose Nyland. I'm writing to you because I'm really worried about nuclear war. I hear there are enough bombs to blow up the world 100 times, and it scares me. It scares the girls in my cadet troop, too. They talk about what they want to be if they grow up, not when they grow up. That's why I'm asking you to please unplug your bombs. I'll bet my bottom dollar, or in your case, your bottom ruble, that if you called President Reagan, he'd do the same thing. It's just someone has to be first. Thank you. Your friend, Rose Nyland. P.S. Don't call the president in the afternoon. I hear that's when he takes naps.
It's the Golden Girls that lighten the mood, right? With the cooling of the Cold War after the fall of the Berlin Wall, nuclear war and devastation in our visual and audio entertainment began to decline. Like the 70s, those storylines began fading away and were amazingly sparse through the next couple of decades, replaced with other global catastrophes and end-of-the-world possibilities, of course, just to keep us on our toes. That is, until Ukraine. And those fears began to rear their ugly head again. Perhaps young people today look at it from a different lens, as they are in no doubt more inundated with the content at an alarming rate. Information at our fingertips isn't always really that beneficial. But as you can tell, even in a period without social media, we still lived alongside the threat of nuclear war every day. And although one generation learned to accept the bomb, and new ones are learning to accept everyday commonplace violence, do we ever really learn anything?
Hello? Is anybody there? Anybody at all?
Okay, let's lighten up. Look around my channel for something a bit brighter. Although this topic is undeniably part of the Gen experience, there are tons of fun fluff that is, well, like this. Pee Wee Herman is the furthest away from a nuclear holocaust. Well, depending on your opinions about his entertainment style, I guess. So yeah, watch that. And please come back for more great content, but only after you've clicked that like and seriously considered subscribing. Thanks for joining me on another adventure through the Gen experience. Until next time.
It burns.